The night was still, the kind of quiet that settled over the sleepy suburban neighborhood like a heavy blanket. Inside the Carter household, Emma moved with practiced ease, pulling the covers up around her daughter, Lily, pressing a soft kiss to her forehead. The little girl had been drifting off, her breaths slow and even, when a faint sound cut through the silence. It was almost imperceptible at first, like the wind slipping through the cracks in the old window panes. But then, it came again, low, drawn out, and filled with something unmistakable. Pain. Lily stirred beneath her blankets, her tiny brows knitting together. "Mommy," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "Someone's crying." Emma froze, listening closely. It wasn't the sound of a person, not quite. It carried a weight, a depth that sent a shiver up her spine, the kind of sound that made something deep in her chest tighten. It came again, a weak, pleading whimper. She straightened, glancing toward the window. Moonlight cast a soft silver glow over the backyard, stretching shadows long and thin across the wooden floor. She stepped forward, careful not to wake Lily any further, and pushed aside the curtain. Beyond their fence, past the small stretch of grass, was the neighboring yard. It was barely illuminated, but through the dim glow of a flickering porch light, she saw something that made her breath hitch. A figure huddled near the far end of the yard, curled in on itself, trembling. At first, Emma thought it might be a pile of old blankets or discarded trash, but then it moved, a slow, almost hesitant shift, as if the effort alone was too much. The shape lifted slightly, revealing two thin, outstretched paws pressed against the cold dirt. A dog. Her first thought was that it must be a stray, but something about it didn't seem right. The way it sat, pressed against the wooden fence, too still, too quiet. It didn't bark, didn't whine for attention the way lost dogs often did. It simply stayed there, shivering, waiting. She nearly pulled back from the window, dismissing it as nothing more than a wandering animal, when a small hand tugged at the sleeve of her sweater. "Mommy," Lily whispered again. She was sitting up now, her wide eyes locked on the same spot outside. "That dog. It's looking at us." Emma's gaze snapped back to the yard. The dog hadn't moved much, but its head had lifted just enough for her to see its eyes, deep, dark pools of exhaustion and quiet desperation. The sight sent a chill down her spine. It wasn't just looking at them, it was pleading. Emma exhaled, a slow, measured breath, but she couldn't shake the uneasy feeling twisting in her stomach. She had seen stray dogs before, lean but alert, always on the move, always searching. But this one was different. It looked like it had already given up. Lily's grip on her sleeve tightened. "Mommy," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's asking for help." Emma swallowed, forcing herself to stay calm. Maybe it belonged to someone. Maybe it wasn't as bad as it looked. But then, why did it feel like she was looking at something that had been left behind? Something forgotten? Another whimper broke the silence. Softer this time, but no less heart-wrenching. Emma turned away from the window, brushing a hand over her daughter's hair. "Go to sleep, sweetheart. We'll check in the morning." Lily hesitated, her small face filled with uncertainty, but she nodded. She lay back down, letting Emma tuck her in once more, though her eyes lingered on the window for a long moment before finally fluttering shut. But Emma couldn't ignore it. Even as she turned off the bedside lamp and climbed into her own bed, she found herself staring at the ceiling, listening. The night was silent again, but the weight of that sound, of that look, stayed with her long after the house had gone dark. Morning sunlight poured through the curtains, casting a warm glow across the kitchen as Emma stood by the sink, lost in thought. The events of the previous night lingered in her mind. The frail figure huddled in the shadows, the soft, painful whimpers that had carried through the quiet. She had told herself to wait until morning, to let the rational part of her take over before jumping to conclusions. But now that the sun was up, the unease in her chest hadn't faded. Lily sat at the kitchen table, swinging her legs absent-mindedly as she ate her breakfast. Every few seconds, she would glance toward the backyard window, her small face creased with worry. "Mommy," she finally spoke, her voice soft, uncertain. "Can we go see if the dog is still there?" Emma hesitated, fingers tightening around her coffee mug. She had already been thinking the same thing, but hearing it from Lily made the decision feel heavier. She glanced toward the clock, still early enough that most of the neighborhood would be just waking up. "Finish your cereal," she said gently. "Then we'll take a look." Lily ate faster, her concern evident in the way she barely seemed to taste her food. Emma finished her coffee in silence, her stomach twisting in anticipation. Once Lily set down her spoon, Emma grabbed a light jacket, and together they stepped out onto the back porch. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and freshly cut grass. A few birds chirped from the nearby trees, but the quietness of the neighborhood made everything feel eerily still. They walked toward the wooden fence, the one that separated their yard from Dawson's property. Up close, the planks were weathered, their once rich brown color faded into a dull gray. Some boards were slightly warped, leaving narrow gaps between them. Emma crouched down, pressing one eye to the widest gap she could find. What she saw made her breath hitch. There, in the farthest corner of the backyard, the dog lay curled up in the dirt, its body barely moving. It was worse than she had imagined. The dog, now visible in the clear morning light, was large, likely a German shepherd, but any strength it might have once had was long gone. Its fur, which should have been thick and glossy, was dull, matted, and patchy in places where the skin showed raw and irritated. Its ribs pressed harshly against its thin frame, a stark contrast to the healthy, well-fed dogs Emma was used to seeing. But it was the eyes that made her heart clench. Sunken deep into its skull, the dog's dark eyes held no spark of life, no curiosity, no defiance, only exhaustion, only a quiet, fading plea. Lily's voice was barely above a whisper as she peered through a smaller crack beside her mother. "Mommy, why does he look like that? Why isn't anyone taking care of him?" Emma swallowed hard, a knot forming in her throat. "He's not a stray," she murmured, her gaze dropping lower. A heavy, rusted chain wrapped tightly around the dog's neck, leading to a thick metal post buried in the ground. The collar it wore was old and too tight, pressing against its skin, the edges darkened by what looked like dried wounds. Nearby, a small metal bowl lay overturned, its inside coated in dust. A few feet away sat a water dish, long since dried up. Emma clenched her jaw. This wasn't neglect. This was abandonment. "Who owns this house?" Lily asked, stepping back slightly as if sensing the darkness surrounding the place. Emma already knew the answer. "Mr. Dawson," she said grimly. Lily frowned. "The man who never talks to anyone?" Emma nodded, her mind racing. Dawson was known around the neighborhood, though not in the friendly way most people were. He kept to himself, rarely coming outside except to collect his mail or toss out his trash. No one knew much about him, and those who had tried to strike up a conversation with him had given up quickly, saying he was curt, dismissive, sometimes outright rude. But even if he preferred solitude, there was no excuse for this. Her fingers curled into fists as she turned back toward the fence. "How long has he been like this?" she murmured, almost to herself. "How many days? How many weeks?" She imagined the long nights, the scorching afternoons, the storms that had rolled through just last month. Had this poor creature endured them all, alone, with no shelter, no comfort? As if in response to her thoughts, the dog shifted slightly, attempting to move. The metal chain rattled and the dog tried to stand. Emma inhaled sharply as she watched the effort it took for the creature to push itself up, legs trembling, muscles weak from disuse. The moment it managed to lift itself halfway, its back legs buckled, sending it crashing back into the dirt. A soft whimper escaped its throat. Lily's fingers found Emma's sleeve, gripping it tightly. "Mommy, we can't just leave him." Emma exhaled shakily. She didn't want to. Every instinct screamed at her to do something, to run into the yard, unhook the chain, and take the dog somewhere safe. But she couldn't just barge onto someone else's property, not without knowing the full situation. She chewed on her lower lip, eyes darting toward the house. The curtains on the back windows were drawn shut, offering no hint as to whether Dawson was home. The place looked cold, lifeless, just like the dog that had been left outside to waste away. She needed to think. She needed to find a way to help without making things worse. Lily pulled at her sleeve again, eyes shining with unshed tears. "Please, Mommy, he's hurting." Emma reached out, brushing a gentle hand through her daughter's hair. "I know, sweetheart," she whispered. "I promise. We won't ignore this." But as she said the words, as she looked back at the suffering creature on the other side of the fence, a deep unease settled in her stomach. Something told her this was just the beginning. Emma couldn't shake the image of the dog, frail, barely moving, its haunted eyes burned into her memory. The moment she had walked away from the fence that morning, a heavy weight had settled in her chest. It wasn't just concern anymore. It was something deeper, something urgent. This wasn't just a case of mild neglect. It was something far worse. And the worst part? It seemed like everyone already knew. Determined to learn more, Emma decided to ask around. She started with Mrs. Holloway, the elderly woman who had lived on the street for nearly 3 decades. The old woman was sitting on her porch, wrapped in a thick cardigan, a steaming cup of tea cradled in her hands. When Emma approached and mentioned Dawson, the warmth in the woman's expression faded. "You should stay out of it, dear," Mrs. Holloway warned, shaking her head. "Everyone knows about that man. He's never been friendly, especially when it comes to animals." Emma frowned. "But that dog, he's starving. He's suffering. Why hasn't anyone done anything?" Mrs. Holloway sighed, stirring her tea absent-mindedly. "Because, sweetheart, people like him. They don't listen. He doesn't take kindly to people poking around his business. That poor dog's been there for years. I don't think he's ever been inside the house, not even when it storms. I hate to say it, but some folks just don't have kindness in them." Emma's stomach twisted. Years? She thanked the older woman and continued her quiet investigation. A little further down the street, she spotted Jake, a 12-year-old boy who was tossing a baseball against the side of his garage. He hesitated when Emma approached, his fingers tightening around the ball. "You're asking about Dawson's dog," he muttered, glancing toward the fence as if afraid someone might hear. Emma nodded. "Do you know anything about him?" Jake looked around, then leaned in slightly. "My dad says Mr. Dawson doesn't like dogs. Not just his, any dogs. He used to chase strays out of his yard with a stick. I heard he hit one once." Emma's heart pounded against her ribs. She didn't want to believe it, but the evidence was adding up. She had seen the state of the dog, how it barely flinched at movement, how it stayed curled up as if expecting to be struck. Anger simmered beneath her skin. She thanked Jake and headed back home, her thoughts racing. She needed to do something. Now, that night, after putting Lily to bed, Emma found herself unable to sleep. She sat up, staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet hum of the house. Then she heard it again. A faint, pitiful whimper carried through the night air. Emma pushed the blankets aside and tiptoed to the window, careful not to wake Lily. She peered through the curtains, her pulse quickening. The dog, Chase, she found herself calling him, was still there, curled in the same miserable position. The temperature had dropped sharply, and the grass shimmered with frost. Chase had no shelter, no blanket, no warmth. He shivered violently. His body curled so tight it looked painful. His nose was tucked beneath his tail, his thin body barely covered by his patchy fur. Emma's throat tightened. She couldn't just stand by and watch. Pulling on her coat, she grabbed her phone and quietly stepped onto the back porch. The cold hit her instantly, but she barely noticed. Her fingers trembled as she dialed the number for the nearest animal rescue. No answer. She tried another. Voicemail. Her heart pounded. She checked the time. Nearly midnight. She tried the local humane society. Nothing. The realization settled in like a lead weight. There was no help coming. She swallowed hard, then scrolled to the non-emergency police line. A sleepy voice answered, calm but detached. Emma explained the situation, her voice urgent but steady. She described the dog's condition, the freezing temperatures, the fact that it was chained outside with no food or water. The officer listened, then responded in a measured tone. "Ma'am, I understand your concern, but we can't intervene without clear evidence of abuse. You'd need to provide documentation, photos, videos, a record of the conditions, and even then the owner has rights. We would have to follow proper procedures." Emma gritted her teeth. "But he's starving. He's freezing. He won't make it through the night." A pause. "I understand. But unless the dog is in immediate physical danger—" "He is in immediate physical danger," she snapped, surprising herself. Another pause. "We can send someone to check tomorrow," the officer said finally. Tomorrow. Tomorrow might be too late. Emma ended the call and lowered the phone, her hands shaking. She looked back at Chase, at the way his chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven breaths. The frost on the ground glistened around him. He wouldn't make it through the night. Her gut twisted. She needed to do something. Now behind her, a small voice broke the silence. "Mommy?" Emma turned to find Lily standing in the doorway of the porch, clutching her blanket around her shoulders. Her eyes were sleepy but full of worry. "You're cold, sweetheart," Emma said softly. "Go back inside." Lily didn't move. Instead, she looked past her mother, toward the fence, toward Chase. "Is he going to be okay?" Emma hesitated. "I don't know," she admitted. Lily bit her lip, then took a small step forward. "Mommy, if I were that dog, would you save me?" Emma's breath caught. The question hit her like a punch to the chest. She swallowed, kneeling in front of her daughter, cupping her small face in her hands. "Of course I would," she whispered, without a second thought. Lily nodded as if she already knew the answer. But then she tilted her head, her expression unreadable. "Then why aren't we saving him?" Emma felt her heart shatter into 1,000 pieces. Lily wasn't old enough to understand bureaucracy, laws, or red tape. She only understood one thing, something that Emma herself had been trying to ignore. Right and wrong. And this was wrong. Emma closed her eyes for a brief moment, steadying herself. Then she exhaled, turning back toward the fence. She had made her decision. She wasn't waiting until morning. She wasn't waiting for permission. She was going to help Chase. Now the night was darker than usual, the air thick with silence, save for the occasional rustle of leaves stirred by a cold breeze. Emma stood at her back door, her fingers wrapped tightly around her phone, her heart pounding so loudly she could hear it in her ears. The weight of Lily's question still sat heavy in her chest. "If I were that dog, would you save me?" She already knew the answer. A glance at the clock told her it was just past midnight. The world was asleep, but Chase wasn't. He was still out there, still shivering, still suffering, and no one was coming to help. Her hands trembled as she zipped up her jacket, grabbing her phone with the other. She had to do this. No more waiting. No more hoping someone else would step in. She stepped onto the cold wooden porch, the boards creaking under her weight. The night air bit at her skin, but she barely noticed. Her eyes were locked on the fence, on the narrow gap she had peered through before. Chase was still there. Emma's breath hitched as she crouched low, pressing herself against the wooden panels. Slowly, she turned on her phone's camera, angling it through the small opening. The screen illuminated the scene in eerie, muted colors. Chase's thin, trembling form hunched in the dirt, the heavy chain clamped around his neck like a cruel collar. His ribs protruded even more starkly under the dim glow of the distant streetlights. His paws twitched involuntarily, his body curling tighter against the cold. She swallowed hard, focusing on the camera, the rusted links of the chain, the overturned water bowl, the way Chase barely had the strength to lift his head. Evidence. She needed evidence. But just as she steadied her grip, the stillness shattered. A door creaked open. Emma's pulse spiked as she froze, barely daring to breathe. From the shadows of the house, a figure emerged, the porch light flickering just enough to illuminate the broad, hunched frame of Dawson. In one hand, he clutched a half-crushed can of beer, his grip lazy, yet tense. His other hand shoved deep into the pocket of his worn jacket. His eyes, sunken and unreadable, swept across the yard until they landed on Emma. She barely had time to process it before his voice, rough and edged with irritation, sliced through the quiet. "What the hell are you doing?" Emma's throat tightened. "Think fast." She straightened slightly, pretending to adjust her phone. "Just making a call," she said, forcing a casual tone. "Didn't mean to bother you." Dawson didn't move. The way he stared at her made her skin crawl, but she held her ground. His gaze flickered toward the fence, toward the dog huddled in the dirt, then back to her. His mouth curled into something that was neither a smirk nor a frown, just something unsettling. "It's late," he muttered. "You should go inside." Emma nodded slowly, taking a single step back. She didn't turn her back on him. Not yet. Dawson exhaled through his nose, lifting the beer can to his lips. He took a slow sip, his eyes never leaving her. Then, just as Emma thought she might get away without further confrontation, it happened. A sharp, cruel yank of the chain, a whimper, louder this time, filled with pain, a sickening thud as Chase was dragged across the ground, his frail body hitting the dirt with force. Emma's stomach lurched. Dawson had pulled the chain, hard. Chase didn't even resist. He had no fight left in him. He let his body be dragged like a discarded rag, too weak to struggle. Emma couldn't stop the sharp gasp that escaped her lips. Dawson's head snapped toward her. For a long, terrifying second, neither of them spoke. Then his lips twisted into something resembling a sneer. "Go home, lady." Emma didn't reply. She turned, forcing herself to walk, not run, back toward her porch. She gripped her phone so tightly her knuckles turned white. Her breath came in short, controlled bursts, her ears ringing with Chase's whimper. She reached the back door, yanked it open, and stepped inside. Only then did she let the panic flood in. Her hands shook violently as she locked the door behind her. Her chest rose and fell in rapid gasps as she pressed her back against the wood, squeezing her eyes shut. She could still hear it. The sound of the chain, the dull thud of a fragile body hitting the ground. Her stomach churned with nausea. She pulled out her phone, fumbling with the screen, barely able to type. She needed to call the police. Now she swiped to her recent calls, redialing the number she had called earlier that night. This time, when the dispatcher picked up, Emma's voice was steady. "I have proof," she said. "You need to send someone, right now." There was no hesitation on the other end. "What's your location?" Emma rattled off the address. Her heart pounded in her ears as she paced the living room, keeping her voice low so as not to wake Lily. "Ma'am, can you confirm if the dog is in immediate danger?" Emma thought of the way Chase hadn't even fought back, of the way his body had crumpled when Dawson yanked the chain. "Yes," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "He won't last much longer." "An officer is en route. Stay inside and do not engage with the neighbor again." Emma exhaled shakily. Too late for that. She nodded, even though they couldn't see her. "I'll be waiting." As she ended the call, she turned toward the hallway, toward the small figure now standing in the doorway. Lily. The little girl clutched her stuffed bunny against her chest, her eyes wide with fear. "Mommy," she said, her voice small. "Is he going to be okay?" Emma swallowed hard. She walked over, kneeling so she was eye level with her daughter. "They're sending help," she assured her, brushing a gentle hand over Lily's hair. "Chase is going to be okay." Lily's lower lip trembled. "You promise?" Emma hesitated. Then she nodded. "I promise." Even as she said the words, she felt the weight of them pressing against her chest, because until she saw Chase safe, until she knew for sure that Dawson wouldn't get away with this, she wouldn't let herself believe it. Emma paced back and forth near the front window, her fingers trembling as she clutched her phone. The weight felt unbearable. Every second that passed stretched into eternity. Her mind kept replaying the way Dawson had yanked Chase's chain, the hollow thud of the frail dog hitting the dirt, the sheer helplessness in his sunken eyes. She glanced toward Lily, who sat curled on the couch, hugging her stuffed bunny tightly. The little girl hadn't said much after overhearing the call with the police, but her wide, worried eyes spoke volumes. The faint wail of sirens in the distance made Emma's breath hitch. "They're coming," she whispered. Lily sat up straighter, her grip tightening around the plush toy. Headlights cut through the darkness, washing over their porch as a patrol car pulled up to the curb. The blue and red emergency lights flashed against the quiet houses, making the moment feel even more surreal. A tall figure stepped out, Officer Ryan Mitchell. Dressed in his dark uniform, he moved with a sense of quiet authority. His sharp eyes scanned the house before landing on Emma, standing frozen in her doorway. He gave her a quick nod before striding toward Dawson's property. Emma forced herself to move, stepping outside, Lily trailing hesitantly behind her. A few of their neighbors peeked out from behind their curtains, drawn by the commotion but not daring to step outside. Dawson's porch light flickered on, and within moments the front door creaked open. Dawson stood in the doorway, his scowl deepening as he took in the sight of the officer. He still had the same beer can from earlier, but his grip on it was tighter, his knuckles turning white. "What the hell is this?" he barked, his voice rough from years of chain smoking. Officer Mitchell remained calm, pulling out a notepad. "Sir, we received a report of an animal in distress on your property. I need to see the dog." Dawson scoffed, stepping halfway out onto the porch. "My dog's fine. Ain't nobody's business how I take care of him." Emma's pulse quickened. She took a deep breath and stepped forward, holding up her phone. "I have video proof," she said, her voice steady despite the fear twisting in her stomach. "I recorded everything. He's starving, chained outside with no food, no water, no shelter. I watched you—" Her voice wavered, but she pushed forward. "Drag him across the yard like he was nothing." Officer Mitchell glanced at her phone, his expression unreadable. Then, without another word, he turned back to Dawson. "Sir, I need you to step aside. Now." For a tense moment, Emma thought Dawson might refuse. His jaw twitched, his hand flexing around the beer can as if debating whether to argue. But when the officer's expression hardened, his shoulders slumped slightly. He grumbled something under his breath and stepped back, allowing access to the yard. Emma held her breath as Officer Mitchell made his way toward the back of the house. She followed at a distance, her heart pounding so loudly she could barely hear her own footsteps. Then they reached the fence, and there he was. Chase hadn't moved much since Emma last saw him. He lay curled in the same spot, his thin body trembling in the cold. His eyes barely flickered open at the sound of footsteps. But when the officer stepped closer, Chase flinched. Emma's chest tightened painfully. He thought they were coming to hurt him. Officer Mitchell crouched down, assessing the situation. His jaw clenched when he saw the rusted chain, the way it cut deep into Chase's neck. He didn't hesitate. He reached for his radio. "Dispatch, I need immediate assistance. We have a case of severe neglect. Dog is malnourished, restrained with a heavy chain, and appears weak from prolonged mistreatment. Requesting animal control and vet support on site." Emma felt a wave of relief so intense it nearly brought her to her knees. She turned to see Lily standing near the fence, gripping the wooden planks as she peered inside. Her small face was pale, but her eyes shone with determination. Then came the moment Emma had been waiting for. Officer Mitchell pulled out a bolt cutter from his belt and stepped forward. He placed the sharp edges of the tool against the thick chain, adjusting his grip before pressing down hard. A sharp snap echoed in the night. The chain fell to the ground. Chase was free. For a long, agonizing moment, he didn't move. He just stood there, stiff, frozen, like he didn't understand what had happened, like he didn't believe it. His thin legs wobbled, his ears twitched, but he didn't step forward. Lily took a small step forward, slipping through the fence's opening. Emma's breath caught, but she didn't stop her daughter. Lily crouched down in front of Chase, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's okay," she said gently. "You're free now." Chase blinked. Then, slowly, hesitantly, he took a single, unsteady step toward her. Then another. Emma swallowed the lump in her throat as she watched the moment unfold. Lily remained perfectly still, her small hands resting on her knees. She didn't reach out, didn't move too fast. She just let him come to her. Chase stopped just inches away, his frail body trembling, his nose twitching as he took in her scent. And then, as if something inside him finally broke free, he lowered his head and pressed it into Lily's tiny hands. A choked sob escaped Emma before she could stop it. Lily's face lit up with a soft, teary smile. "See?" she whispered, running her fingers gently over his ragged fur. "You're safe now." Emma wiped her eyes as Officer Mitchell straightened, giving her a knowing glance. "We'll take it from here," he assured her, motioning toward the animal control vehicle that had just pulled up. But Emma already knew. Chase was going to be okay, and for the first time in a long, long time, so was he. The ride to the veterinary clinic was silent, save for the low hum of the car's engine. Emma sat in the passenger seat, her hands clenched tightly together, while Lily sat in the back, eyes locked on Chase, who lay curled on a blanket. His breathing was shallow, his body motionless except for the occasional twitch of his ears. He didn't fight. He didn't resist. It was as if he had accepted whatever fate had in store for him, whether good or bad. Emma swallowed the lump in her throat. She had expected him to react, to whimper or whine, maybe even lash out in fear, but he simply lay there, too weak to care. Lily's small hand rested near him, not touching, but close enough that if he wanted, he could reach out. He didn't. But she didn't move away either. "It's going to be okay," Lily whispered, more to herself than to Chase. "You're safe now." The words hung in the air like a promise. Dr. Lauren Hayes was already waiting when they arrived. She was a woman in her early 40s, with kind but sharp eyes that missed nothing. The moment Chase was lifted from the car and onto the examination table, her gentle hands moved over him, assessing the damage that neglect had left behind. Emma and Lily stood nearby, watching in silence as the veterinarian conducted a thorough examination. "He's severely malnourished," Dr. Hayes murmured, her voice calm but tinged with concern. "His weight is dangerously low for a dog his size. He's dehydrated, his muscles have atrophied from lack of movement, and—" She carefully touched the raw skin beneath his collar. Chase flinched slightly but didn't growl. "This wound looks like it's been here for a long time." Emma's chest tightened. "He never barked," she said softly. "Not once." Dr. Hayes sighed, lifting Chase's paw and inspecting his nails. overgrown and cracked from neglect. He's learned that making noise doesn't get him anything. No food, no kindness, maybe even punishment. Dogs like him shut down after a while. It's a survival mechanism. Lily looked up at her mother, confused. "But he survived," she said, her voice filled with quiet wonder. Dr. Hayes glanced at the little girl, a small, sad smile tugging at her lips. "Yes," she said. "He did." Emma exhaled slowly, pushing past the emotions threatening to choke her. Can he recover?" Dr. Hayes nodded, though her expression was serious. "Physically? Yes. But it's going to take time. His body needs to regain strength, and his digestive system has to adjust to eating properly again. We'll have to start slow, small portions, hydration therapy, antibiotics for the wounds. Emotionally," she hesitated. "That's harder to predict." Emma's hands curled into fists. "I'll do whatever it takes." Dr. Hayes met her gaze, something like understanding passing between them. "Then he has a chance." Lily stepped forward, her fingers gently brushing Chase's paw. "We'll help him," she whispered. Chase didn't move, didn't react, but Emma saw it, just the faintest flicker in his dull eyes, like somewhere deep inside he was still listening. Chase remained at the clinic for observation, hooked up to IV fluids, his frail body slowly beginning the long process of recovery. But he was distant, detached. He refused to eat at first, barely reacting to the food placed in front of him. He wouldn't lift his head unless absolutely necessary. The only time he moved was when a vet tech or doctor. Hayes needed to clean his wounds. Even then, he didn't fight. He had given up on the world. But Lily hadn't given up on him. She came every day after school, slipping into the quiet room where Chase lay curled in his soft bed. She never pushed, never forced him to interact. Instead, she talked. She told him about their home, the soft couch he could sleep on, the backyard he could run in when he was strong enough, the toys she had already picked out for him. She told him about the places they could go, the treats he could eat. She told him about freedom. And even though Chase never lifted his head, never showed any sign that he understood, Lily never stopped. "He's listening," she told her mother one evening, curled up beside Chase's bed, her fingers tracing circles on the floor. Emma smiled softly, brushing her daughter's hair back. "How do you know?" Lily hesitated, then looked down at Chase. "Because his ears still move when I talk." Emma's breath caught. She hadn't noticed it before, but now that Lily pointed it out, she was right. Even in his broken state, Chase was still listening, still holding on. The fourth day was like any other. Lily arrived at the clinic after school, chattering as she settled into her usual spot beside Chase. She was midway through a story about a funny thing that had happened in class when it happened. Chase moved, not much, just a small shift, just the tiniest twitch of his tail. But it happened. Lily gasped, clapping a hand over her mouth, her eyes shining with excitement. "Mommy! Did you see that?" Emma had seen, and so had Dr. Hayes, who had just entered the room. The vet's brows lifted in surprise before she crouched down beside the bed. Chase's eyes met Lily's for the first time. It wasn't much. His gaze was hesitant, unsure, wary. But it was there, a connection. Lily didn't move, didn't reach out. She just smiled. "It's okay," she whispered. "You're safe now." And then, for the first time since his rescue, Chase wagged his tail. It was weak, barely more than a twitch, but it was something. Emma clapped a hand over her mouth, tears burning in her eyes. Dr. Hayes let out a quiet, amazed chuckle. "Well," she murmured, shaking her head, "I'll be damned." Lily just beamed. "See, Chase," she said softly, "you can trust us." Chase blinked slowly. Then, ever so hesitantly, he let out a quiet, raspy breath, almost like a sigh of relief. Emma reached out and gently placed a hand over her daughter's. They had a long road ahead, but for the first time, Chase had hope. Weeks passed, and Chase grew stronger. His once frail body filled out with proper nourishment, his wounds slowly healed, and the light in his eyes began to return. He still had moments of hesitation, flinching at sudden movements, freezing when unfamiliar voices filled the room, but he was learning that not all hands were cruel, that kindness existed, that love was real. When the rescue center finally deemed him ready for adoption, Emma knew what was coming before Lily even spoke. The moment they mentioned looking for a family, Lily's head snapped up, her little hands gripping the hem of Emma's sleeve. Her eyes, wide and determined, left no room for debate. "Mommy," she said with absolute certainty, "Chase belongs with us, right?" Emma laughed softly, shaking her head at how easily her daughter made the decision for her, as if it had ever been a question. She reached for the adoption papers, her heart swelling as she signed her name. Chase was coming home. The day they brought him home, the world outside was painted in warm golden hues, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the front yard. Emma opened the car door, stepping back to give Chase space. For a moment, he hesitated. The world beyond the shelter was new, unfamiliar. He sniffed the air, ears twitching, eyes darting toward the open doorway of the house. Then Lily giggled, stepping forward and holding out her hand. "Come on, Chase," she said, her voice light and full of warmth. "This is home now." At the word home, something in Chase seemed to shift. Cautiously, he placed one paw on the pavement, then another. His steps were slow at first, but as he crossed the threshold into the house, Emma could see it. The way his body relaxed ever so slightly, the way his tail gave the smallest, hesitant wag. Lily was already waiting inside, a brand-new blue collar in her hands. She knelt down, her eyes shining with excitement. "This is for you," she whispered, gently slipping the collar around his neck. "Now you belong with us." Chase stood still as she fastened it, his nose twitching as if memorizing her scent. Then, out of nowhere, he took a small step forward and licked her hand. Lily gasped, then let out a delighted giggle, wrapping her arms around him in a careful hug. Emma felt the sting of tears behind her eyes. Chase, the dog who had once believed love was beyond his reach, was finally allowing himself to feel it. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow through the windows, Chase curled up beside them on the couch. For the first time in his life, he fell asleep feeling safe. This heartwarming story is more than just a tale of rescue. It's a testament to the resilience of animals and the power of kindness. Stories like these remind us that love, patience, and compassion can heal even the deepest wounds. Chase, a German shepherd, endured years of neglect, yet he never lost the quiet hope that someone might finally see him. His journey is one that resonates deeply, not just with dog lovers, but with anyone who believes in second chances. There's something profoundly moving about dog stories. They reflect the purity of unconditional love, the ability to forgive, and the courage to trust again, despite past hardships. Too often, animals suffer in silence, waiting for someone to intervene, to offer them warmth and safety. This story encourages us to be that someone, to look beyond what is convenient, to stand up against neglect, and to make a difference, even if it's just for one life. Chase's transformation is not just about survival. It's about finding a place where he truly belongs. It's a reminder that every abandoned, mistreated animal is capable of love if given the chance. And perhaps, in saving them, we also discover something within ourselves, a deeper empathy, a renewed faith in the goodness of the world, and the simple but profound truth that kindness has the power to change lives. Share your thoughts. We'd love to hear from you. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another amazing story. Together, we can shine a light on the power of doing what's right. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.